Welcome to Micro Live, which today comes from one of the largest telecommunication research centres in Europe. It's British Telecom's Research Laboratories at Martlesham Heath near Ipswich. In the good old days of the GPO, research was a part-time occupation for 2 or 3 employees. Now the staff at Martlesham alone number 2,500.
Thank you, everybody. Well, we recorded that opening sequence yesterday along with some other pieces for the show. This morning, poor Lesley was quite ill, and she's now back at the hotel, tucked up in bed with orders not to move. So, Lesley, if you're watching now, get well soon. And at very short notice, Fred Harris has dropped everything to come along and help us out.
Not quite everything, Mac.
Well, welcome, Fred. Now, we've also been joined by our American reporter, Freff, live from New York on a British Telecom video conference circuit. Hi, Freff. Is it all working?
It's all working just fine, Mac.
And how's the weather over there? We've got a lot of snow here in East Anglia.
Now, there's no snow, but it is bitterly, viciously cold. It's about 14 degrees outside and very chilly.
Well, we're looking forward to coming back to you later on in the show. Well, this month's news was bad for home micro manufacturers. Some makers of the Wren Micro and the largest distributors of Sinclair machines went into receivership, followed by Oric, who now have 3 companies interested in buying them up. Of course, this week saw some bad news for Acorn, the company who make the BBC Micro. 2 days ago, the company laid off some 30 staff and asked for its shares to be suspended after they'd fallen to an all-time low of 28p, so that the company could have a chance to reorganise its affairs. The shares were put on the market 2 years ago at £1.40 and rose to £1.96 at the height of the micro boom when the whole industry was extremely optimistic. So somebody made a lot of money, and it looks like somebody's going to lose a lot of money. Today, the BBC issued the following statement.
The BBC understands the concern of the many people who own BBC machines and are talking to Acorn about this at the present time. The BBC understands that in any reorganisation, Acorn will of course take care of the interests of existing and future BBC Micro owners.
3 things happens to Acorn. First, the news that it was virtually abandoning the American side of its business led to a loss of money and confidence. Then, along with other companies, Acorn predicted a large Christmas sale, but in the event, sales were disappointing and dealers left with heavy stocks. Although the BBC machine still holds over 75% of the upper end of the home micro market, Acorn's down-market machine, the Electron, has had to fight the most cutthroat competition and has fared badly. As a company, it's devoted large resources to developing a very wide range of products and selling them overseas. Although it's been in trouble in the States, it's been successful in selling BBC machines to many Commonwealth and European countries like Australia and Holland. But the press seem to have had it in for Acorn, and this volatile industry press comment can have a disproportionate effect. Yesterday, Acorn was refusing to speak to the press, but Micro Live was able to see that the work was going on unabated on more new products for the BBC Micro system. But we'll be watching developments, and next month we hope to bring you better news about the company's fortunes.
Microvitech of Bradford have launched a new touch-screen device which clips on the front of their monitors. The screen works on an infrared matrix system, which means that there's a network of invisible red lines crisscrossing in front of the screen. When your finger breaks through these lines, the computer works out which part of the screen you're pointing at and acts accordingly. Well, here it's playing noughts and crosses. It's a very nifty idea. The good news is it's British, and it'll be available to the public from September at about £270.
Okay, Freff, what's the news from the United States?
Well, I've got 3 things of interest, Mac. First, from Chicago, and indeed first because it's from First Comics in Chicago, a comic book drawn entirely on a Macintosh computer by Uncle Michael Sands. Now, let me use this camera here in the rostrum to close in. That's it. It's called Shatter. Everything's drawn on a Macintosh, and the English audience will be interested in the fact that it will start appearing in Big K magazine there next month.
Amazing. That's incredible.
Item number 2, from a music show in California. That synthesizer, which is the Casio CZ101, Well, it only sells for $500, but 2 months ago, that much musical power would have cost you $2,000. It's caused quite a stir in the industry here.
Is the cup a vital part of the music scene? What's in the cup,
The
Freff?
cup is there for size, to let you see how big the keyboard is. It's not very large at all. The other box is the Pitch Rider 2000 from Canada. That's a device which you sing into or play a flute or a violin or anything to. It's got a microphone in front of it, and it listens to what you're doing, analyzes the pitch, figures out what note you were trying to hit, tells you how close you were with the readout on the front, and if you want to hook it up to the synthesizer, it can tell that if you're playing an A, it should tell the synthesizer to play an A. So I could walk in and sing Mary Had a Little Lamb, and the synthesizer would play right along with me.
What do you do if you're tone deaf?
It doesn't play very well, but it also will teach you. It's got earphones to feed back the right tone into your ears so you can know what you're trying to hit. The third item of news, which I'm going to show you one thing here real quick about this room I'm in. This is a wonderful room. See? Now, the third item of news is from Apple Computer in California. They started most of the big home microcomputer craze here in the States. They're making a big move on IBM in the business market now by introducing an expensive laser printer that's heavily computerized and a networking system which allows Macintoshes and IBM PCs to come together. At the same time that they're making this big move on the business market, the original founder and designer of the Apple computer, Steve Wozniak, has announced he's leaving the company to start his own video venture. He says 10 years in computers is a little too much for him, and he's got $100 billion from his 10 years, so he should be well capitalized.
Oh, well, he's done very well out of it. Tell us, what's happening to Acorn in the United States?
Well, Acorn in the States, I called them yesterday, and they are continuing their slow and steady attempt to sell computers to the schools, and only to the schools. They don't want to try and compete in the national marketplace with the Commodores, Ataris, Apples, and IBMs, which is fairly reasonable since they don't have the advertising budget to do so. Unfortunately, schools buy things on a yearly basis. It takes a long time to ramp up, particularly when you're unknown. And Acorn admitted to me that they are selling in the thousands of machines annually, not the tens of thousands, which means they've got a long way to go yet here.
Thanks a lot, Freff. We'll come back to you.
Well, there's been plenty of gloom and despondency to choose from in the press this week. The latest prediction is that as the dollar is so high, computers which rely on parts from the States will go up in price. But 2 days ago, Victor Technologies, who make the Sirius, said that the strength of the dollar made it so expensive to manufacture in the US that they were to cease production there and were actually thinking of coming to Europe, where it's half the price. So if we can't afford American computers, we may end up getting American jobs building them.
That sounds a good idea. Well, our special guest this month is, of course, John Alvey, who's Director of Development for British Telecoms and Chairman of the influential committee that produced the Alvey report. John, how big an impact has a microcomputer had on the telecommunications industry?
Well, perhaps I can demonstrate that most graphically, Mac, by showing you this old piece of switching equipment which has been used throughout the world for 50 years, mechanical, rather slow, needing rather a lot of maintenance. But of course these days, with the advance of computers and the move into the digital age, one can put a 32-bit microprocessor, and I've got one on the end I type in. So in essence, one can use that technology in our digital exchanges and reduce their price and in fact increase their efficiency and reduce their size. At the same time, we will be seeing later in this program the impact of optical fibers, which again are digital. So yes, computers and communications are converging on a digital path.
Not implying that, an exchange will all go on the end of your typing.
No, give us another decade or two.
You think that could happen?
No.
It's a very nice thought. Will it reduce the number of exchanges or just the size of the actual exchanges themselves?
It will reduce the number of exchanges in the trunk network, but of course the local exchanges that connect individual customers, by and large you need those where the customers are, so you'll still need about the same number of exchanges.
Yeah. Telecoms will save money. What about the end user in the telephone? Will he have his telephone bill reduced?
But of course.
Ah, thank you. Well, thank you, John. We'll be talking to you again later. The convergence of computers and telecommunication technology was apparent at the 1985 Wick Computer Show held last month at the National Exhibition Centre near Birmingham. Here's Lesley with a report.
Well, here we are then. This is the 5th Wick Computer Show, and it's their biggest ever. There are 394 exhibitors filling 2 huge halls at the National Exhibition Centre near Birmingham. This is strictly a business show, and there's been no expense spared to sell the product. The show's so big that Scion have had a great idea. They're lending out their organisers, which have been programmed with information designed to help people find their way around the show. Well, I've had a great idea too. I've got my own organiser. I'm just following John Coll around. John, are you enjoying the show?
Yes, there are a lot of interesting things to see, really a great deal. One of the things that's really struck me is the extent to which IBM compatibles are appearing on all the stands. Virtually any stand you go to, their machines compatible with the IBM PC.
You mean manufacturers are actually making sure their machines behave like IBM?
That's right.
That's
a lot of copying going on. Yeah. But we're on the IBM stand now. We're not going to show you a computer. There are a lot of interesting things, but we've got a printer here, which really is lovely. The quality of the printout is quite
daisy
excellent.
wheel?
It isn't daisy wheel. It's a sort of dot matrix. We'll have a look inside and see how it works. This, in fact, uses a carbon ribbon assembly. It's a fairly ordinary carbon ribbon. And the thermal head heats that carbon ribbon up and prints it out on the material behind. This is the thermal head, and you may be able to see about 40 tiny little points which heat up and melt the carbon on the paper. Not only have you got the choice of pieces of carbon ribbon, but you can also change fonts quite easily. Just replace the ribbon on there, like that. The fonts are held in little cartridges like that, and you have 2 cartridges in the machine at any one time, over 500 characters. But the most amazing thing is that not only can you print out on paper, but you can print out on things like overhead transparency acetates, or, would you believe, guess what I've got for you?
You are?
A paper handkerchief, or a real handkerchief even, right.
That's really useful, John.
Well, I know it's a bit of a gimmick, but it's beautiful because it shows, you know, how effective it is at printing out on other materials. Pull it through a little bit, and would you believe, we can actually make it print out on the handkerchief.
Well, everybody seems to have launched their portable computer in the last couple of months, and they're all here, aren't they?
Yes, it's the portable show in many ways.
Yeah.
This is lovely. This is the DG1. It's got a full liquid crystal display.
It's a 10-inch screen, isn't it?
Yeah, full size,
yeah.
25 lines down. It's got a pair of disk drives at the side and connections for a modem at the back. The most amazing thing about this is that it's fully IBM PC compatible. So all the software you use in the office on your IBM PC, you use on the train.
Marvellous.
Excellent. I think that's going to be used by accountants, people like that, serious people who need applications.
And who need to travel and work at the same time.
Right.
Yeah.
The other trend we've seen is towards dedicated portables. This one isn't quite dedicated to a task, but nearly. It's the NEC machine. There's a little wheel on the front, and that turns around. You can use it to measure distance. And there's software package available for this, for electricians and plumbers and carpet layers and so on, to enable them to work out areas and so on, store information in it. So we're almost moving towards dedicated micro there, single purpose.
Is it still a general purpose one as well?
Yeah, you can use it for all sorts of other things as well.
Yeah.
This next one really is a dedicated micro. This little sharp machine is a navigation aid, and it's got a whole load of programs in it which enable you to navigate when on a ship. You can find your position from stars, there's star tables in the back, you can work out distances and times and so on.
And where you are.
And store the results.
Excellent.
Absolutely dedicated to that
And
job.
minuscule.
A minute little thing.
Yeah.
But on the way in, I saw something enormous at the other end of
Oh,
the
I
scale.
saw it too.
Yes, the Big Mac,
Yeah.
pardon the phrase, but there was this whopping great Macintosh, and Apple were making a lot of point that they got a lot more software for the Macintosh. The bit they're pushing really hard is the Lotus Jazz program, which is an integrated bit of software. Now, I went over to the Lotus stand, had a good look at it, and it's got word processors, spreadsheets, and all sorts, but I found as soon as I got onto it, it crashed out of its mind. And that I found very worrying 8 weeks before the launch of the product. But Lotus said, well, Symphony hasn't got any bugs in it at all, nor's 123, and nor will Jazz. OK, fine. I'll wait and see.
If it does what it promises, is it going to be good?
It looks really good, yes.
Right. Oh, did you notice that the Oberon character reader has won the Rita Award?
Right, for the best
newcomer
new
of the
Yes,
Lovely.
that's a lovely device. It enables you to put a document down with print on it and then scan the document across, and the characters are actually read into the computer system. That's really nice, and only £400. The price has plummeted.
What do you think of the show in general?
It's an enormous show. I was very impressed with lots of things we saw. We only looked at a fraction of the items. But I'll tell you one thing that really worried me, and that was that often when you went onto a stand and asked one of the salesmen a question which wasn't quite in his sales patter, it collapsed around the place. That happened time and time again. It's quite worrying.
So the products are beating the salesman at the moment, almost.
Yes, I'm afraid so.
Grand stand, digital.
Lovely, isn't it? Really nice.
What have we got here?
We've got Deck Talk, which is a voice synthesizer, and just listen to this.
Now it's your turn. Please enter the words that you would like me to say.
That's a cut above the average voice synthesizer.
Beautiful quality. All you do is you just type in the words that you want. Micro, live.
Yeah.
Micro live.
Ah, I've got the live instead of live.
All right, get over that. Just listen. M-I-C-R-O, L-I, try again, L-Y-V-E, R-B-B-C-2.
You spelt it phonetically there.
Right.
Micro live on BBC 2.
And it gets it right. This thing is really intelligent. It tries to pronounce things phonetically, and it realizes that L-Y-V-E is a very possible thing to pronounce, so pronounce it live. But BBC 2, no chance, it's not Publica 2, so it says BBC 2. Isn't that beautiful?
Marvellous. What's its applications?
Well, it's really a replacement for a printer, so wherever you've got a printer plugged in, you can use it. For example, electronic mail. If you want to read electronic mail, you normally have to have a computer. But if you're travelling, you don't want to cart things around. Instead, you could have this at home, phone home, E.T.
And it will tell you your messages?
It'll read it all back to you.
Oh, that's
yes.
splendid. What about cost?
Cost about £4,000, £5,000. Quite expensive,
Yeah.
but Stevie Wonder can afford one for his electronic mail, so it can't be bad.
Seriously, that is an excellent spin-off for blind people, isn't it?
It really
as well?
is, yeah.
Now, of course, if the atmosphere in the office gets a little bit tense...
Then I have the perfect solution for you. I'm going to play you something like this. It's a love song. I think it's your favourite. You'll really like this.
Strangers in the night,
Oh, John.
exchanging glances, lovers at first sight, they knew the chances. It turned out alright for strangers in the night. Dooby-dooby-doo,
Thank you, everybody. We'll let you know later. But in the meantime, don't give up your daytime jobs. And poor old Frank Sinatra is probably going to be replaced by a computer. Well, we've got a telephone here connected into this oscilloscope. And when you use a telephone, sound waves get converted into electrical voltages. And these vary continuously, or to use the jargon, they're analog. And you can see it on this dooby-dooby-doo. And you can see the waveform coming out. Well, we've put the waveform here on a computer, and when it's transmitted over a distance, the signal gets weaker, so it has to be repeatedly amplified. But it also suffers from interference, and that's that on there. Now, this doesn't have much of an impact on the strong signal, but when the weak signal is amplified together with the noise, you get this sort of effect, and the sounds you get out of it sound really grotty.
And a very similar thing happens with a television picture. With the help of Peter Cochrane, who is involved in transmission systems here at Martlesham, we've set up a demonstration. Now, here's a television set, almost exactly the same as the one you've got at home. And we're sending an analog TV signal through a length of coax cable. This is the sort of thing that goes into the aerial socket at the back of your telly. Well, we've got a reasonable picture of the motley crowd we've got here at Martlesham. Give us a wave. Wave to your Auntie Gladys. That's it. Show you live. Well, Peter, what would happen if this cable here was very, very long?
Well, as you've already remarked, Fred, this picture is really only just acceptable. And what I'm going to do is increase the cable length artificially. Actually, what I'm doing is reducing the transmitter power. As I reduce the transmitter power, we see that the picture degrades nice and smoothly and goes down until we reach a point where we've just got snow.
But it degrades almost straight away, doesn't it?
Yes, indeed.
And that's the sort of thing that you get with a very badly positioned television aerial.
You do indeed.
Well, one way to overcome this problem is to encode the signals digitally. For example, the music on this compact disc, and you're familiar with this, they're encoded digitally, and when they're read, they give an almost perfect reproduction. Well, we've got our sound wave here, and to convert it into digital information, it's sampled on a regular basis, and the height or the amplitude of the wave here is converted into a number, and that in turn is converted into its binary equivalent. And then that's transmitted as a series of ons, zeros, or ones, offs along the line. Well, let's look at the difference when we transmit a television signal digitally.
Well, we've moved across to a second setup, which looks almost exactly the same, but this time we're transmitting the signal digitally. Once again, we're starting with a good picture, but Peter, what happens if we reduce the signal strength?
Well, I think the first thing to point out, Fred, on this experiment is that the transmitter power is exactly the same. Again, I'm going to reduce the transmitter power down, and as I do, we see no visible degradation of the picture for quite a way.
That's still a very clean picture, isn't it?
Still a very clean picture, until I get to a point where it starts to become spotty. Now, just past that point, the picture very rapidly crashes.
And that's what they call the cliff effect.
That's right.
Right, but we had a much cleaner picture for longer.
Yes, indeed, we did.
Well, we can explain what's going on like this. Here's our wave there of binary information, and as it goes over a distance, of course, it gets weaker and weaker. And there's our noise. Again, the noise doesn't really affect very much the strong signal, but when it's imposed upon the weak signal and then the weak signal is amplified, we get something like this, which looks fairly terrible. So what we next do is put a slice right across it, and anything that's above the slice we count as a 1, anything below the slice as a 0, and we can reconstitute quite accurately the waveform that we actually sent out. Well, a much greater fall-off in signal strength can be tolerated before we lose picture quality. So digital transmission is much better for keeping the integrity of signals over long distances. Another benefit is that the equipment for handling digital signals is cheaper, it's more reliable and more efficient. And since digital information is what computers like, the telephone service can be computerized and a greater variety of services provided.
Well, the really extraordinary thing about this digital demo is that we're not using 1 kilometre of coaxial cable. We're in fact using optical fibre, and it's 100 kilometres of it wound on these 10 drums here. Now, just think, that's enough to stretch from here in Ipswich down to London, and yet we still had more than sufficient signal strength to provide an acceptable picture. There's no way that coax could have coped with that sort of distance, except with very expensive amplifiers.
Well, today's telephone service transmits a relatively narrow frequency band. My voice is now being distorted to telephone quality, and that's a range of about 3,000 cycles per second, or hertz, compared with 14,000 or so that we hear normally. Well, if you look at this, we see that's the spread of bandwidth, if you like, of the 14,000 hertz that we hear in normal speech, and that's the 3,000 that we get, 3,000 hertz that we get from the telephone, and that's called bandwidth. It's the techie word for today. By comparison to this narrow bandwidth, radio has a bandwidth of about 15,000 hertz, and television has a bandwidth of an enormous 5.5 million hertz. Well, this is a standard telephone cable with 2,000 wires of the sort connected to your telephone. Today, we can send all these different calls down a single wire, and it's the sort that you'll perhaps recognize, and it carries the TV signal from the aerial to your actual set. It's called a coax cable. This piece of cable is the sort used to carry calls from London to Birmingham, Manchester, and it has 18 coax cables in it. Each of these can carry the same number of calls as this bundle, 2,000 all at once. So how can you get more than one call onto the same wire? Well, one way is similar to radio. And we have a radio here, and this is picking up signals from many different stations, and to select one, you have to tune the radio to a particular frequency. So each of the 2,000 different calls on a wire is sent on its own frequency. Obviously, the more signals you can squeeze onto a single cable in this way, the better in the end, though even expensive cables run out of bandwidth, and that limits the number of signals you can fit on them. Well, since light waves are about 1 million times higher in frequency than radio waves, they can support enormously higher bandwidth, more calls, television pictures, data links, the lot. This is an optical fibre, and one of these fibres is actually carrying as many calls as a single coax cable, as many as a bundle of 2,000 wires. Now, in order to send a signal down a piece of glass, you need a laser, and this is a model of this is a laser here, and it's sending light along here. I've got to keep my finger out of it, it's quite powerful, into this optical fibre here, and if you look carefully, dim the lights a bit, you can actually see it coming out there red. Now, if I rotate this wheel, it will cut off that light, and if I can actually make it rotate, and that is effectively sending a message. And for those Morse code freaks or sailors, you'll recognize that. That is SOS, and if you ever get into trouble, that's the sort of signal you have to send out. Well, of course, this is mechanical. In real life, this is done electronically. In real systems, the laser is switched on and off 140 million times a second. Here at Martlesham, they've operated a laser at 2,000 million times a second, a world record, and that's nowhere near its theoretical limit. That means the entire Encyclopaedia Britannica could be transmitted on an optical fibre in about half a second. Now, within 2 years, there'll be over 70,000 kilometres of optical fibre in the ground in Britain, replacing expensive copper cable. But it's not as easy to deal with as the old-fashioned stuff.
Well, they called in the experts. No, not me, actually. The boffins here at Martlesham have been working hard to perfect a piece of equipment that will do the job properly. They've called it the Mini-Mob, and it solves all their boring problems. Ooh. Here she comes. Hold it! Great. Now then, a larger version of this piece of equipment has been around for some time, but this mini-mole really does promise to revolutionise the way that all distribution cables are laid. It's an impacting device, it contains a heavy piston, and it tunnels its way through, driven by compressed air. Attached to the back of it down here is a length of plastic duct, and this is just pulled through into position. Now this is fast, it's accurate, and because it's so small it can be used to lay a length of cable underneath the road, say, without actually disturbing the surface of the road itself. And of course this represents a huge saving in labour costs. Now, being the BBC, we have dug an enormous hole, but that was so you could see what it was I was talking about. Normally the launch pit for the mini-mole need be, well, only as big as the hole over there. Now, the problem with laying optical fibres is that they're very fine, so they can very easily be damaged, and a whole new way of handling them has had to be thought out. Once the plastic duct is in position, then some of these rigid hollow tubes, which will protect the fibres once they're in position, are pulled through in the normal way. But the fibres themselves have to be blown through using a compressed air machine. Now, just have a look. There are 7 optical fibres contained in this plastic coating, so you can imagine just how tiny and how delicate they are. You thread the fibre into the machine, and then by twiddling the knob, you can feel the fibre being just taken up there. And then once that's it, the end of the fibre appears in the tube, you can apply a little bit of pressure and switch the machine on, and the fibre is pushed gently on its way. Now, the fact that the fibres are pushed and not pulled means that they won't snag on anything and there's no strain on the fibre, and this is a particular advantage if you're trying to lay optic fibre cables in buildings, because sometimes you have some very severe angles to go round, and that's how the fibre crosses the road. The next step is to join the fibres into the network. Now, joining optical fibres is tricky because, again, they're so fine. They must be joined to an accuracy of within 1/100th of the thickness of a human hair. And if that joint isn't perfect, it will interfere with the transmission of the signal. Researchers at Martlesham have developed a splicing device that automatically lines up the 2 ends to be joined, and then at the touch of a button, they're fused with an electric arc. But how do you keep track of all those cables once you've laid them under the ground? Well, in the past, it's all been down to the time-consuming business of updating paper maps by hand. But now, that can all be replaced with this Laserdisc system. And I've got Mike Gray here, who's going to demonstrate the system. And at the moment, Mike's just flicking through a couple of the possible 55,000 map frames that are held on the Laserdisc. It's an area of Liverpool, and Liverpool itself that's under scrutiny. That's a large-scale street plan of an area in Liverpool, and by superimposing the information held in the computer onto the original map from the laser, you can see at a glance where the cables are laid. They're represented by those green lines. And because the computer graphics are locked to the map from the Laserdisc, you can update all sorts of information as an area changes. The white patch to the right of the screen represents somewhere where some demolition has taken place since the original Ordnance Survey map was transferred onto the Laserdisc. You can even lose the original Ordnance Survey map from the background there and then see really clearly the information that's held on the computer.
Well, the picture of me that you're watching at the moment is reaching your television screen by a complicated route. First, it's going from Martlesham to the Telecom Tower in London, then onto the television centre, and finally it's distributed to transmitters all around the country. Each of these steps requires the equivalent of over 1,000 telephone lines to cope with the large bandwidth of the television signal. By contrast, our link with Freff in New York on British Telecom's video conference system needs only 30 telephone lines. That's because it uses a rather clever trick to reduce the amount of information that must be transmitted to produce a picture. Well, if you look at this one up here, this isn't part of the equipment, it's just showing the signal that is being transmitted from the States at this moment. Now, Freff, if you move your hands a bit, and we can just see his hands there. And what is happening is only the information that changes is actually being sent over. The rest of the information is stored in a frame store within this piece of equipment itself. Right, Freff, jump about a bit. Yes, you can see it blurs a bit. You don't get the full image being transmitted, but it's very nice. Normally, this is used, the people in the conference will be sat out in front of this, and the camera would look at them, and they can see the picture that's going out by this screen here. You can actually see our cameraman there. If you wave your hands, everybody. And there are a variety of other cameras that you can actually attach to the system. Freff, you've got some of those showing, haven't you? There it is. There's a wide-angle camera, close-up. That's very nice. Well, Freff, what about showing us your gadget? Tell us what it is.
Oh, that's an auto dialer. This is called a dial-a-card. Now watch this. I turn it on. See, a little cursor will appear. Should appear. There it is. Now I type B, C, search, and the number that's been stored in memory in the card will be played back in tones through this little speaker into the phone. Like so. There's 7 numbers being transmitted right now. And it's not working. Just a second. One more try. I had to wait for the dial tone. And that phone right there rings. And I can talk to myself.
That's wonderful. All that complication just to stop you pressing a few buttons. It's absolutely intriguing.
Well, it'll hold 63 different numbers by name. So if you want to remember a salesman's name or your mother's name or something, instead of all these complicated numbers, it's very easy to remember that Ethel is there. You type the first 3 digits, first 3 letters of her name, press search, you've got it.
Well, thank you, Freff. Now, don't rush out trying to buy one of those auto dialers because, like many telephone gizmos you can get in the States, they won't work here on your current exchange equipment. But with the new digital networks and computer exchanges, British Telecom promises a whole range of new services. Earlier today, John Alvey and I had a look at some of them. John, if I had access to your digital network from my home, is this the sort of telephone I could expect to be using?
Yes, it might look very much like this.
And what sort of services would it have over what I can do already on my phone?
Well, we're talking to computer enthusiasts tonight, and one of the things that you can certainly do with this is get an 8 kilobit link into the telephone exchange and into databases. And the interesting thing is at the same time one's got a 64 kilobit telephone link working simultaneously over the same pair of wires, and indeed yet a 3rd channel over which you can get messages sent to you.
And that telephone link is as good a quality as we're getting today, or better?
Yes, indeed.
And these messages, I could say, well, Granny's on the phone for you or something.
If there was enough market demand for that, Mac, we could do that.
That's very nice. And I can see when I'm blocking the telephone line with my tone, it infuriates everybody when they're trying to get hold of me, so people can actually ring and get through to me whilst
Yes,
I'm
you can have 3 channels working at the same time over the one wire.
And what's this?
Well, another piece of equipment that works at this 64 kilobit rate. We were talking to Freff earlier over the Confravision across the Atlantic, and he was describing how, in fact, you can reduce the bandwidth needed to, in fact, transmit moving pictures. Here, again, we're reducing the bandwidth even further and passing pictures at 64 kilobits, and you can see they're being written rather slowly across the screen.
With Freff, we're using 30 channels. On this, we're just still using one single channel.
That's quite right. This is working on just on one voice channel.
What sort of application do you see for this?
Well, typically, I think an application we would see would be for security, where you've got cameras looking, say, at your warehouse to see whether, in fact, it is being burgled.
Oh, I can see myself on there now. And if I move, I presume I'll disappear.
That's absolutely right, yes. Or typically, I can look somewhere else inside this establishment, and here, in fact, we're looking at Gwyneth sitting alongside a facsimile machine. And indeed, she's sitting alongside a machine that is very similar to this one, which, again, works at 64 kilobits. And typically, facsimile machines, of course, send documents such as that. Now, if I send this document to Gwyneth, it will, in fact, pass over the telephone line at 64 kilobits, which is about 6 times faster than the current one.
So that's the real advantage this has over current fax machines, because we can do this today on ordinary telephone lines. It's,
yes,
it's 6 times faster.
This goes at 64 kilobits, about 6 times faster than facsimile works over the current analog telephone channels.
Now, with a bit of luck, we should be able to see on this scanner, well, she hasn't moved yet, hasn't Gwyneth? Oh, yes, she's moved.
What
she's
I'm, in fact, asking Gwyneth to do is, in fact, actually to sign this document and send it back to us. And that will all happen in the space of about a minute.
Well, there she is, holding it up. So presumably she's signed, she's holding it up, and she's putting it back in the machine. So I guess any minute now we should expect to see it here.
Yes.
Which are the main customers for this sort of equipment?
Typically banks and insurance companies are very interested in this kind of application where you want to fill in a proposal form at an office of an insurance company, send it to the head office for annotation and maybe for correction, and then indeed it will come back to you, and this machine is just about to send this back to me.
Well, it's a real test to see whether Gwyneth actually signed it.
Here indeed, Gwyneth has signed it. And all of that took just over a minute.
This looks rather like a computer terminal.
Well, in fact, this is a view data terminal which is working again at the 64 kilobit rate, and the beauty of that is, of course, that you can write up the frames very much faster than you do over the normal analog channel, and indeed one can send pictures.
So it's rather a high-speed Prestel with colour pictures.
Yes, indeed. And I mean, if one looks at an application here, one see how fast the frames write compared to an ordinary Prestel machine. Looking down the menu, let's look at sort of places of interest, and shall we go to Sheath Hall? And indeed here I'm going to put a picture of Sheath Hall. You'll see that it comes up in black and white first. If you like it and want to look at it, you can in fact wait while it comes up in colour.
Who's going to use it?
Well, typically I mean travel agents, interesting to show you the villa that you might rent. Estate agents, showing you in fact the houses that you might look at. You could look at them in black and white first. If you don't like that particular house, go on until you find one you do like, and then wait for it to come up in colour and study it in more detail.
Thank you very much, John. Now let's go back to Lesley. Last summer, she was hanging around outside a school in North London.
It's the middle of the summer holidays, and all over the country, schools and colleges like this one are empty. Millions of pounds worth of equipment are securely locked away, waiting for that first week in September when the pupils return. What a waste. But in fact, this particular college is different. It's open. It's become for 6 weeks a holiday computer camp for the use of hundreds of local children. Toynbee Hall Community Computer Camp uses the premises of the East London College. For £25, children come all day, every day, for a week, have a computer to themselves and plenty of personal attention. Last summer there were over 100 community computer camps running in Britain, but the origins were small.
We used a lot of computers ourselves in our own organization, and lots of people wanted to borrow them, and then people started asking us about them. We began to run programs for kids who were interested in learning more than games on computers. And then we set up our first community computer camp, which was extraordinarily successful. Tremendous deluge of people coming in. And we decided that it would be nice, since we had all these requests, to help people set up their own independent community computer camps in any town or city in the country.
People from all sorts of backgrounds have run community computers and asked for help to set up and run their own community-based computer projects. They're all independent, and they just need to find premises, equipment, and a bit of funding, and we've helped them to do that.
Interaction can give practical help by lending out extra equipment, in this case for the younger children.
I'll go forward.
Yes, okay, do that. Forward with a gap, then how far do you want it to go forward?
20.
Try 20, that's a good one. Okay. And return. Button? No, the other one, you've got the restore one. Press that one. That's right. That's good.
The children are using Logo, which is a standard first step towards understanding the concept of a programming language.
What was different about it?
The turtle is showing them in a concrete way the results of the commands they've given to the computer. Don't be deceived by the informal atmosphere. There is a lot of learning going on.
Bits inside, the chips. Do you all recognise a chip inside there? Those little things, long black things, the little metal legs. They're the microchip, and they're the what control the turtle and tell it how to do everything.
But it's not only schools and colleges that provide premises for computer camps. This is Ufton Centre, home of Hackney Computer Access, which has been running successfully now for the last 3 summers. Interaction encourages the hardware manufacturers to loan out their equipment. Spectrum, Torch, Commodore, Apple, Acorn and Microvitech have all seen the advantages of making their products available to a new generation of users. Is this your first year here?
Second week, yeah, first year.
And could you program at all when you came here?
Very slightly.
What language are you using?
Basic.
And have you learned that since you've been here as well?
Yeah, some of it.
At this camp, around 200 youngsters between the ages of 12 and 25 are benefiting from a week's intensive computing. Some of them came here last year, and no doubt lots of them will come back again next year. There's plenty to do here because the more experienced people lend a and with teaching the beginners. But that's not the end of the story either, because part of Interaction's ideal is to establish all year round computer clubs so that the interest that's been generated, the progress that's been made during the summer months isn't lost.
If you can get another 250,000 young people involved annually in exploring something that it's the tool of the present and the future, the job opportunities that will arise out of those discoveries, the fact that a lot more people will be pushing that industry ahead much further, has a tremendous implication, not only for them in their own lives, but for the country as a whole.
If you want more information about how to set up your own computer camp or where your nearest is, write to this address: Interaction, Royal Victoria Docks, London, E16 1BT.
But John Alvey was the chairman of the committee that recommended that the government invest, along with industry, £350 million over 5 years in research into advanced information technology. This was in response to the Japanese government's investment in fifth-generation computers. John, I'm often being asked what a fifth-generation computer is, and I've always found it very difficult to answer it. I've really got the man to ask now. What is a fifth-generation computer?
Well, I really was hoping you weren't going to ask me that question, Mac, but because I think myself and the rest of the world find difficulty answering it, it's really to do with computers that show some signs of intelligence, and we don't quite know how to define that. But perhaps if I go a little further back, we were looking there at computer camp on really rather simple computers, doing rather simple calculations, attacking rather simple databases. And I think the next step that we go on from there is into the expert system, which essentially is a computer that begins to replace an expert.
Could you give me an example of that, how you envisage it being used?
Well, I suppose an example fairly close to home is if you're trying to replace the family doctor in his initial diagnosis, and you feed in the series of symptoms as you understand them, maybe prompted by the computer to ask you relevant questions, and at the end it comes out with an answer. And an interesting point about that, perhaps if the answer that comes out is you really should go away and shoot yourself, then maybe you would like to probe back into why the expert system gave you that answer. It's an essential part of an expert system that it does explain itself to you as well as giving you an answer.
Would you imagine that somebody could actually speak to the computer if they were going in and saying, "Doctor, I feel ill," and the machine says, "Well, what's wrong with you?" And they said, "Well, I've got a pain over here," and you would actually speak to it. That's a lot further than voice recognition has got today.
Well, you're right. One saw some aspects of voice synthesis in that computer show video, but one can at this moment recognize perhaps a few hundred words in a computer which has been trained to a particular speaker's voice. Or we get into more difficulty if you're trying to talk with connected speech. I mean, if I asked you a question like, "Wreck a nice beach," or did I mean recognize speech, you can see that the computer would have difficulty differentiating between those two.
Can you imagine how voice recognition will be used in British telecoms?
I can think of a very good application in British Telecom. At the moment, I mean, we are, of course, an undertaking that communicates right around the world. You communicate with many countries who speak other languages, and we have to have operators who speak those languages to help people make telephone calls to those countries. If in fact you could speak English into a machine and it could recognize it, translate it into the language at the far end, you could do away with that operator, and that would make our telephone calls even cheaper for you, Mac.
Could I imagine that I could phone up and say, given the phone number of John Alvey lives somewhere in London, and some computerized voice would say 4835, but it's a secret number, I'm not going to tell you the rest. Could that be happening? Would it save telephone directories?
Yes, you could certainly use that kind of application in telephone directories, but we're a little way yet from having a foolproof system that could recognize that sort of thing.
Freff, perhaps I could bring you in at this point. What's happening on artificial intelligence in the United States?
Well, there are 3 colleges, universities actually, where a lot of research is going on. That's MIT, Stanford, and of course Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. And all of them are taking different approaches and have differing levels of success. I think the most exciting stuff that I've heard of is some work in something called fuzzy logic, which is teaching computers to think a good deal like the fuzzy ways we think. And that's at Carnegie Mellon, mostly. They have a backgammon program there that has actually beaten the world backgammon champion. Now, outside of the universities, there's a lot of work in various companies, such as the big one, IBM, and some smaller ones like Kurzweil AI. Now, they say the AI stands for Applied Intelligence, but of course we know it's a way of co-opting a common term. They're working on a voice-activated typewriter, which implies massive speech recognition. They've had a lot of success in the past in reading machines and in digital synthesis So a lot of people are watching what they're doing quite eagerly.
Could you give us an example of this fuzzy logic?
Now let's see, fuzzy logic. How do you tell the difference between the digital signal that you had earlier, on, off? But how do you tell whether an orange is sweet or a little sweet or bad or very sweet or whatever? It's a continuum that's being communicated. And the people there are finding ways to communicate that to the computers, allow them to make decisions based on that information.
Thank you, Freff. Well, John, we're spreading our money, it seems, over lots of different projects, where the Japanese seem to be putting it on one big project, a lot of money and centralized control. Is that a sensible thing to do?
Yes, I think that we have a lot of catching up to do in this country. The Japanese, when we talk about the fifth generation computer, are just talking about one aspect of a program that's been running for many years. And certainly when the committee I chaired looked at this, it was clear to us we had to cover a lot of subjects: scale integration, computer software, the man-machine interface, and indeed these intelligent systems, to cope with and compete really with the kind of program the Japanese were mounting.
Could you give me an example of this very large-scale integration? Why do we need such powerful computers?
If you're in actual going to try to simulate this thing that we've got up here, this funny old sort of computer that we've got up here, very fuzzy, as Freff was saying, if you're going to try to simulate it, you need an immense amount of computing power. You've certainly got to work in parallel, you've got to work fast, you've got to access immense databases.
So what's the bottom line? What are we going to get for our 350 million?
Well, the point really about this is there's a world market at this moment of at least 150 billion in information technology. By the end of this decade, you can confidently predict it to be 500 billion. The oil will run out. We've got to live on our wits once again. And certainly this area of information technology is where you live on your wits.
Certainly is. Thank you very much, John. Well, in this next week's Listener, there's a chance to win a micro with a speech and music synthesizer in a joint micro live and listener competition. All you have to do is to answer 6 ridiculously easy questions about computers. Well, the first question is, which is the odd one out? Apple, IBM, Commodore, Apricot, or Sinclair? I told you they're easy, and if you get all 6 correct, there's also a tiebreaker. Details are in the Listener, on sale next Thursday.
Next month, we're back in London, and hopefully Lesley will be with us as well. That's for the last programme in this current series. As well as some homemade table tennis playing robots, which I just got to see, we'll be looking at the increasing use of laser discs with micros, and I'll be reviewing some lap-held computers.
Well, that's all from us. Thank you, everybody here. Thank you to John Alvey. Thank you to Freff in New York. Thank you very much. Thank you, Fred, for stepping in at such short notice. And that's all for us, so goodbye.
Goodbye.